episode of Mind the Gap with me, Emma Turner, and my co-host John Hutchinson. Hello, John.
Hello, everybody. Good to be here. I'm excited for this one.
You sound very chipper for somebody who's not on half term yet.
I know, but I get to spend the next hour talking to Leora. It's genuinely, it's like Christmas for me.
Oh, fantastic! So you've just given a hint as to who our guest for today is, and it is Leora Cruddas, who we are absolutely delighted to have on. So welcome, Leora.
Thank you so much. I'm delighted to be here with you both.
Oh, thank you. For those people who might not know what your role is or where you kind of sit within the sector, just give us a flavour of your kind of route into the education space and what your current role is at the moment.
Gosh, there's a long story there, Emma.
I'll strap in. I'm ready. I'll
tell you the short version of it. So I was born in South Africa, in apartheid South Africa. Grew up in the segregated state education system, so went to an all-white school. I think I always knew I wanted to be a teacher. I think lots of teachers say that. So studied to be a teacher at the University of Witwatersrand in South Africa. When I finished my teacher education, I started a master's degree. I knew I did want to teach, but the state education system was still segregated back then. So I went to teach in a school in the township of Alexandra. So most people will know Soweto. That's the very famous township southwest. And Alexandra is on the opposite side of Johannesburg. So Alexandra is, a place that was full of culture and life, but also beset by the most grinding poverty. The school that I taught in was not funded by the state. So at that point in South Africa's history, state education was not free or compulsory for Black children. So it was funded by non-governmental organizations, and it ran out of a community hall. So perhaps what we might know as a free school now, except the free schools are funded by the state here. And I think what I want to share is that almost everything that I believe to be true about education now, I learned in those years. So it was hugely formative for me as a young professional. And most of what I hold on to and the values that I espouse by education now were formed back in those years.
Mm-hmm. I don't think we've ever had a more interesting introduction into teaching than that one. I did not know that about you, Leora. And in terms of your role now, what's your role now? What would people know you for at the moment?
So I am the chief executive of an organization called the Confederation of School Trusts, or CST. This is an organization that I founded working with a board of trustees 6 years ago. In fact, 6 years ago on Friday, the 18th of October. So this feels a special moment. I reflected in the position that I then held, which was Director of Policy and Public Affairs for ASCL, the Association of School and College Leaders, job that I absolutely loved. I reflected back then that the emerging trust sector was without proper representation at the level of the institution, so not the level of the leader, because obviously ASCL represents school and college leaders, but there wasn't an organisation that represented trusts as organisations and spoke authoritatively to government on behalf of trusts. So ASCL works very closely with the Association of Colleges, the AOC. AOC is a sector body. So if you join the AOC, it's the further education college that is the member, not the individual. And it seemed to me back then that what the emerging trust sector needed was the equivalent of an AOC. So I looked around at other public sector organisations, and of course there's the NHS Confederation. So I started to think, I wonder if this is what we need. So I left ASCL and I set up CST, which is the sector organisation, the national organisation representing academy trusts in England.
Wow. John.
Yeah, Laura, can we just take a moment just to take stock, I guess? So it's happy anniversary coming up, and maybe a good time to take stock, a bird's eye view, because the academies program, I know that it started under Labour, but I guess we're getting into about 15 years of kind of the big drive for academies. And then over those last 6 years, the sort of increasing number of schools being represented in multi-academy trusts. And in some ways that's kind of developed by design, in other ways kind of organically. Could you give us your assessment of what's gone well there through those sort of over these last 15 years, and what perhaps hasn't developed as well as it could have within the school structures around trusts and academies?
So what's gone well, even better if. So I think I should also say that most of my professional life has been working in local government. So I believe in local government, absolutely. I believe in the authority, the responsibility and legitimacy of local government. And I'll say a bit more about that when I talk about what's gone well and even better if. So as you mentioned, John, the academy movement was actually started under the previous Labour government, Blair's government. And at that point, it was a programme to address endemic failure, largely in secondary schools and urban conurbations. So when the coalition government was formed in 2010, there were only 203, if memory serves me correctly, academy schools in the country. You will recall that Michael Gove, then Secretary of State, brought legislation to Parliament that was the 2010 Academies Act. And it was that legislation that saw the real proliferation, the growth of academy schools and the growth of groups of schools working together in deep and purposeful collaboration in a single governance structure. So you might say, well, what made you believe in academies then if you're working kind of in local government? And I think I would reflect that local government has lots and lots of responsibilities that they do really well, including, of course, one of the responsibilities is maintaining schools. But I think I began to believe that it is the task of educating our children is such an important task that it actually needs a specialist organisation with specialist governance, a bit like a GP surgery. We wouldn't think it was a good idea for the government to maintain GP surgeries, would we? Because we understand that a GP surgery is a specialist organisation, needs clinical governance. So I think that's true of schools as well. So the idea that you would get specialist organisations set up for the purpose of advancing education, public benefit, which is the charitable purpose of school trusts, is a brilliant idea. It's an absolutely brilliant idea. So we've seen a huge growth in academy schools since that 2010 legislation. So we now have around 60% of all children in England educated in the academy trust sector. And here's a stunning data point. 82% of all children who grow up in disadvantage are educated in our secondary schools in the trust sector. So that's amazing. And that is because the trust sector was started with kind of a disruptive mentality. So those founding CEOs, they wanted to go out and make sure that schools in the most poverty-stricken, the most disadvantaged areas in the country were doing good things for children. So they started to go into these areas and to take on schools that had failed. And they worked with these schools as part of a group, part of this deep and purposeful collaboration, to make those schools into good schools, schools that communities can really be proud of. And it's that kind of disruptive mentality, disruptive mindset, which I think we need to hold on to now. We need to say in this period, in this post-pandemic period, where we're facing all sorts of challenges, including the widening of the disadvantage gap, that refinding that moral purpose around closing that gap, working in the hardest areas, in the most disadvantaged areas, and making our schools places where communities can be really proud of. I think we've done that really well, and that is a huge success of the trust sector. So what would I say we've done less well in those years? Well, I think we've had successive governments, not all of whom have been clear about their view of the vision for schooling. I suppose we might call the end state for the school system in England. So we've had a few attempts to try to require schools to join trusts. I'm not sure I think that's the right thing. I don't think that forcing people to do something is necessarily helpful. I think there's too much of a compliance mindset in schooling in England. I think we have to know why we're doing something. So it's really important that we develop a case within the trust sector for why the group of schools working together in deep and purposeful collaboration is our best bet for a system that keeps getting stronger. Frankly, I no longer think that that's a job for government. I don't think any governments since 2010 have done it very well. I think we need to do it now. We need to take on that responsibility. So I think that's one of the things that we could have done better. I also think it took us too long to ask the question, what is a strong trust? So we at CST asked that question in January 2022, which is before the last government's white paper. And it's a powerful question, isn't it? If you're going to build organisations in the schooling system in England that are responsible for schools, we should have asked, perhaps earlier than we did, how we make these organisations strong, how we build the capacity of these organisations. So I wish we'd asked that question sooner. But we have asked it now, and we're working to codify what makes a strong trust. We're working with our members in lots of different ways to codify what makes a strong trust, and that feels really exciting right now.
In terms of that codification, are there common elements? Because I work with lots of trusts up and down the country. Some are massive, absolutely huge, nationwide reach. Some are very geographically kind of close together, quite small, deliberately want to be small. Are there common elements to all trusts, regardless of size, location, geography, demographics that the schools serve? What are those? If there are any, what are they?
Yes, there are. And in starting to codify the features of a strong trust, we have started to make sense of that. So fulfilling the core charitable purpose, advancing education for public benefit, is something that is common to all trusts, must be common to all trusts. So that high quality inclusive education, our first responsibility is to run good schools, schools that communities can feel proud of. So that doesn't matter the size of the organisation. That is absolutely core to what we do. Within the trust sector, we also have some responsibilities under law and under regulation. So good governance would be one of those things. All trusts must have good governance. Probably that's an area that's weaker at the moment than I would like it to be. And since CST has existed, we have tried to strengthen the proposition of governance, because up until I think we started to codify it, it was still quite muddled. And the proposition of maintained school governance and the proposition of trust governance was being muddled, and that's very unhelpful. So strengths in terms of the proposition of governance, doesn't matter what size of trust you are, that is important. We have some responsibilities in terms of dealing with public money. We deal with public money, and that public money is entrusted to us, and we have responsibilities to use that public money for the purposes that Parliament intended, and to use it well. And that is also common to all trusts in the country. So you can see where I'm going with this. I think that there are some really important pillars of what is a strong trust, which we have now codified in our thought leadership. The way that trusts execute those responsibilities might be different depending on the size of a trust. But the fact of those responsibilities, I think, is absolutely essential to our success.
Yeah, And I suppose that kind of commonality as well as diversity within the sector and across trusts, is interesting and perhaps challenging for you as the sector body that represents trusts. I sometimes almost think of you as an MP who like it is the job, because with MPs sometimes they say, is the job to kind of lead the people and make the case for things, or is it just to essentially be the mouthpiece for their constituents in Parliament? Like, this is what my constituents think, and it's my job to kind of relay that. Or is their job to lead their constituents and say, look, I think that this would be and I almost imagine there's a similar thing with you. To what extent is it your job to set out a vision for what you think trusts could and should be, and to what extent is it to understand and try and I don't know, find consensus amongst what you're hearing from the different trusts that you represent?
John, in reality, it's both. And it's really important that it's both, because we're a membership organisation. The best practice, the best insights, they come from our members. So why would we not seek to codify those and to share those? But we also have a leadership role. And I think any leader would have a version of this, wouldn't they? How much are you with the people that you lead? How far do you step out beyond them, not going so far that they can't recognize what you are attempting to do? So there is definitely a leadership role. Part of the leadership role is the aggregation of insight, the aggregation of the best practice in the sector that we can highlight and elevate and codify and bring to others.
That was I haven't thought of it like that. So you're almost getting to the leadership through the representation aggregation. That's a really nice way of putting it. And I know that one of the kind of ways that you've been leading is to almost reimagine, and all of your reports are just required reading. They always shift my thinking tremendously. But I think that you introduced this kind of idea of civic anchors, of public institutions, of schools and trusts being able to act as kind of anchors within their community, civic anchors. Can you just talk a bit about what you mean by that?
Yeah, so there's also a story there. So I'm an English teacher. I think you would guess that I'm going to answer that question through story. So Christmas 2019. I spent that Christmas with my family who were here from South Africa. But I was thinking at that time that actually the challenges that face us as educators and as leaders mean that we have to start thinking differently about the task of leadership, what it means to lead. So I wrote a paper over that Christmas period, which was called back then Systems of Meaning. So it attempted to map the systems of meaning within which trusts are located. And what emerged from that paper is 3 leadership narratives. So the first is the leadership of your organization, trust leadership. So that's the domain-specific piece of leadership. And we need trust leaders who hold that domain-specific knowledge, because it is different. The job of leading a trust is different from the job of leading some other organization. So that's really important. Of course, there's quite a lot of debate in the sector about whether you lead through generic skills or whether you lead through domain knowledge. So I do think you lead with domain knowledge. I think that's really important if we are to build good schools in England. But I think the job is greater than that. So the second of the nested leadership narratives was civic leadership. So this is about how we lead with other civic actors for a greater common good. And that's actually encoded in our charitable purpose. So the charitable purpose to advance education, beautiful wording, to advance education, not provide it, advance it, but for public benefit. So not for the benefit of the children in the schools that we lead, but for public benefit. So encoded in that charitable purpose, I think, is the responsibility to look out beyond the trust that you lead and to care deeply about what's happening for families and communities in those places where you have schools. So that's the task of civic leadership. But even that is necessary but not sufficient. So the third of the nested leadership narratives is system leadership. And for me, I don't like the definition of leading beyond the school gate. I'm not particularly interested in that. I think it's how you act on a system rather than just acting in a system. So most of the time we're acting in the system. We're just responding. We're responding to what the government says. We're responding to the policy environment. We're in responsive mode. So how would it be if we changed that a little bit? And if we started acting on local, regional, national systems? And we saw the leadership task as a different kind of relationship with government, a more adult to adult relationship with government, where we lead the design of the school system in England. We act on it. So those were our three nested leadership narratives. Of course, that paper we published in January 2020, 8 weeks before the global pandemic. 8 weeks. How could I have known that would happen? And so this language of civic leadership, which I'm not claiming to own, by the way, civic leadership has been around for a long time, but the language as we had applied it to the trust sector started to gain some traction in the pandemic. And people saw their task as a civic task in the pandemic. So coming out of the pandemic, I rewrote that paper as new domains of educational leadership. And I started to talk about this domain, back to this concept of the domain knowledge. What's the domain knowledge you need to lead your organization? What's the domain knowledge you need to be a civic actor and a civic leader? And what's the domain knowledge you need to act on the system, not just in the system? That's a live conversation. And then if I may go on and tell another story, after our conference last year, I attended a dinner with vice chancellors at the beautiful, beautiful old library at Queen Mary University in Mile End. So Mile End, a mile from the City of London, one of the wealthiest cities in the world. And you will probably know the poverty of Mile End. And one chancellor after the next stood up and talked about the place that their universities were in as being really, really significant. The place of universities as being anchor institutions, anchored in their communities, working for a wider common good. So universities are knowledge institutions and knowledge building institutions, but they also exist in place. This was the day after the Labour Party conference had wound up that year. Not a single vice-chancellor talked about politics or the Westminster bubble or anything else. And sitting, listening to those vice-chancellors speak in that way, I sort of felt I had like an epiphany. Like, oh my goodness, have I become too captured in the Westminster bubble, too caught up in the cycles of government and political cycles? Should I be encouraging CST members to think in longer terms than these political cycles? And this is where the idea of building public institutions came from. Institutions that have longevity, that will outlive the CEO as the leader. How do we steward that sort of system if we're thinking in those longer political cycles? And that is what our conference this year is about. It's thinking in that longer term.
I'm absolutely captivated by that narrative, Leora. I didn't want you to stop talking then. I was thinking, keep going, keep going. But how are you going to build on that there at your annual conference then? So what's the focus? What's the structure? What's the kind of conversations that you want members to have the opportunity to have in that conference setting?
So I think the conference theme is called Building. And my speech is going to focus on building in different kinds of ways. One of the interpretations of that is building public institutions. But another interpretation, which I'll cover in my speech, is building public trust and confidence. So I think we have seen in Western democracies a significant decline in public trust and confidence in our public institutions, which includes schools, of course. So we started to see that decline before the pandemic, but then it got exacerbated in the pandemic, as did lots of other things like our children's mental health. So coming out of the pandemic, we were dealing not just with children who hadn't been at school for extended periods, but actually this loss of public trust and confidence. And now we see that playing out in some of the behavior that we're seeing in our schools, in the exponential rise in parental complaints. There's something about that bond of trust, this social contract, that is frayed, or might even be broken, in fact, but I think it's frayed. So we could say, well, we seek to lead in a society we wish to create. But that, I think, is a fool's errand. So we lead in the society in which we live. And the society in which we live is having some difficulty at the moment trusting public institutions. So what are we going to do about that? Let's have some conversations about how we, as leaders, how we respond to this challenge of rebuilding public trust and confidence in our school system. I think we can do that, by the way. I'm not at all defeatist about that. I'm pretty certain that we can do it. And part of that is, John, you and I have talked about this a bit, the shift from transactional ways of talking to and about our communities to more relational ways of talking with our community. So building that narrative out that says education is a common good, but we know right now it's not speaking to all our communities. So let's try to have that conversation really, really respectfully. And that's part of what we do as anchor institutions, because we are anchored in our communities.
It's interesting hearing your personal story at the start and where you are now, Leora, because there's almost like a revolutionary zeal to the we are the people that we've been waiting for. You often hear education's a political football. We should take education outside of politics, and then you know, it sort of stops there, other than a vague kind of hand wavy, let's take education out of politics. But it sounds like, you know, this mission that the CST is kind of leading is for the profession to reclaim. It's like the profession to reclaim what education and what schools are for themselves.
Absolutely. By the way, I don't think we should take education out of politics, just to be absolutely clear on that point. We live in a democracy, and I wouldn't want to live in anything other than a democracy. So I absolutely want to respect the legitimate rights of a government to set the accountability system, to set the conditions within which they publicly fund our state schools. If we decide we're taking education out of politics, I think that's a very, very dangerous place to be. And I wouldn't want that for this country. I think we need to learn to work with governments in a different way, in a different tone, but we should not be seeking to take education out of politics. But yes, I do have I think a pretty missionary zeal around some of this. I think we can lead differently. I think we should lead differently. I think we should think in longer term timescales. That is not disrespecting political cycles, because we live in political cycles, but we can still have longer term ambitions than just the ambition of the government of the day. And I do think we should reclaim the narrative around public education in England. We're about to jointly publish a paper with the Church of England and the Catholic Education Service, which argues that the basis, the purpose of schooling should be human flourishing. That's the flourishing of the adults as well as the flourishing of the children, and and the flourishing of our community. So that feels really important to me, and that is to put my arms around all the work that we've done on the knowledge-rich curriculum, which I absolutely believe in, because interestingly, not because I read Hirsch, although I did read Hirsch, but actually because I was born in a country where the right to an education and the right to knowledge was prescribed for white children and not for black children. So there's something, it resonates with me very deeply that we need to prescribe an entitlement that is a knowledge-rich entitlement. But I think that there's something also beyond that, and that it's about preparing our children to live a good life in society, and about developing human capacity.
Emma, I know that you're working with lots of schools who are kind of doing maybe trying to square those two. They've done lots of good work on developing their curriculum, but also feel like there's something else. I know you've spoken about that before. Is that kind of chiming with what you're hearing on the ground?
Very much so. That kind of trying to strike that balance between allowing children to be introduced to the richness of things that we know, while still giving them the opportunity to develop as unique individuals and have all of the opportunities that are out there. It's a real balancing act for schools, and sometimes as well, as we were talking in our previous conversation with Aziza, it's context dependent, and there are difficult decisions to make because resources are finite. Recruitment is a challenge. Recruiting teachers in to actually teach the rich, broad curriculum is a challenge. And that was something I wanted to pick up on as well, Leora, because we need to have staff to teach in our schools. So I wanted to kind of have your take on what challenges trusts are facing in terms of recruitment, and what CST might be working on or thinking on around recruitment and retention.
Sure. So I'm going to step back and perhaps just talk a little bit about our relationship with government. Mm-hmm. So what tends to happen when there's a problem in the system is we bang the table and we say government must do something. Then typically government tries to do something, and then sometimes we bang the table again and we say government must not tell us what to do. That's a vicious cycle, and I think we need to create virtuous cycles. So on recruitment and retention, it is true that government has the big levers of state to ensure the supply of teachers. And we do need government to look again at those big levers of state to make sure that we do have a supply of teachers into the system. But on retention, wow, that's a matter for us as employers. So we set the culture of our organizations. We literally control the conditions. What leads us to believe that it is government's responsibility to retain our staff? Now, we could say, well, our teachers are leaving because of a very high stakes accountability environment. And I think that's true. I do think that's true. I think there are some things that the state needs to look at in terms of the retention of teachers. But at best, we share responsibility in relation to retention. So last year, just before Christmas is clearly a moment for me, right? Just before Christmas, Sinead, the wonderful Sinead McBrearty at Education Support, published a report that I found absolutely terrifying to read. It's Teacher Wellbeing Index. And it said really, really difficult things for me to read. Things like 89% of our teachers and leaders are feeling anxious and stressed and horrible about the work they do. That's a little bit worrying. Now, some of that will be related to accountability, but surely not all of it. What can we do about it? So that's the important question. What can we do? What can we do to change this? So just after that, Becky Francis, at the Chief Exec of the Education Endowment Foundation, published this absolutely brilliant and really underused piece of research, which was an evidence review of the conditions and the climate that we can create as leaders that directly lead to the retention of our staff. And I thought, gosh, well, we should read that. And the evidence review cites three things that we should be doing as leaders. So the first is building relational trust. So how do we build relational trust with our staff? What does that look like? There's quite a lot of evidence, actually, about what that does look like. The second is that we should pay attention to professional development, not just the state-mandated programs of professional development, although those are really important too, for lots of reasons we probably can't get into today, but the cultures of professional development, the organizations we lead, really important. And the third is paying attention to working conditions. So workload is part of that, but working conditions is actually slightly wider than just looking at workload. So we convened a summit in July last year, a couple of days after the general election, in which we posed that strategic problem to our members. And Sinead gave the opening provocation, where she took us through that terrible, really concerning data. And then Becky, the following morning, did a magnificent review of the evidence about what we can do. And then we spent the rest of the day looking at, so what are the solutions? What things are in our gift to do as leaders that can retain our teachers? And it's this, you can see there's a theme emerging here, isn't it? It's the agency of the leader that I am most interested in. And I think we have more power than we think we have. There is more that we can do than we can believe. So, John, what you said, we are the leaders we've been waiting for? Absolutely. There's no cavalry coming over the hill. We are the leaders we've been waiting for.
And maybe that's why you said you were drawn slightly to, you know, some trust CEOs, especially with this kind of disruptive edge, especially running towards schools who historically haven't served, especially children from experiencing disadvantage historically, and that willingness to kind of act within all of the power that they have, even if that's not sort of the norm. But could you talk a little bit about it can't all just be disruptive edge, right? so how do we counterbalance the kind of disruptive edge with
the stable core, I think you're the words you're looking for. So another story. Last year, I came across a book by a brilliant academic, Alex Hill, who's, by the way, speaking at our conference this year. The book is called Centennials, and he had researched organizations that have been around for 100 years or more and the mindset of those leaders. It's a brilliant research proposition. Loved the idea of it. So he looked at that. What's the leadership mindset of those organizations that have been around for more than 100 years? And one of my favorite pieces of the book is where he talks about stable core, disruptive edge. So we need a stable core in our organizations. And that brings us back to the strong trust work, right? We need a core of strengths that is stable and solid, and we do really magnificently well. But coming back to that mindset, the original mindset of the academy movement, we still need to hold on to that disruptive edge. And Alex Hill found that those organizations who've been around more than 100 years, they have that stable core, disruptive edge. And I love that phrase.
Love that. It's like an educational twinkle in the eye as well as at the same time. I absolutely love that. One thing I wanted to ask is, I work with lots of schools, lots of trust schools, lots of maintained schools, and it was just about the perception of where academies and trusts are, because there's still in some pockets of both sort of parental perception or teacher perception or maintained school perception that trusts are something to be fearful of. They're kind of, well, it's an academy, or it's a trust. What can be done, do you think, potentially to disrupt that narrative? And why do you think that still potentially persists in some areas?
Well, there's so much in that question, Emma. So much. Where shall I start? So the first thing is, I don't think we have told the story of the trust movement properly yet. I went probably a couple of years ago now and reread that March 2022 white paper, which said all schools will be in a trust by 2030, which, by the way, was never really going to happen. But I read it from the point of view, if I was the head teacher of a maintained school, can I find in this white paper the reason why I should join a trust? I couldn't. There's no story. There's quite a lot of technical detail there, but there was no story that appeals to our hearts, to our moral purpose, to why we came into education. So I wrote a paper which was really the attempt to do that, the attempt to tell my story about starting with why the trust, why the trust movement, why join a trust, what's that about? So that paper exists. It draws very much on a quote from Steve Mumby, formerly the chief executive of the National College for School Leadership. And it's not the story of fear, it's the story of hope. It's the story of we will prevail together. It's the story of the depth of moral purpose and collaboration, the story of solidarity, as opposed to the story of autonomy. So I think the story of autonomy is quite a dangerous story, because it is a story that is told in the interests of adults. So why don't you want your school to join this trust? Because I don't want to lose my autonomy. The point at which we start making decisions on behalf of our children from the vested interest of adults is the point that our education system will start to fail. So I'm much more interested in the much more powerful language of deep and purposeful collaboration, of our solidarity with each other. That is why we came into education. But that story we haven't yet told properly, and it hasn't yet reached everybody. And there are lots of stories out there that offer a counter narrative to that story. And the counter narrative is quite well established. So the story of the trust as the private entity, the story of the trust as the corporate structure, the story of the privatization or marketization of education. These stories are quite well established. We have to disrupt these stories. We have to replace it with a story of deep and purposeful collaboration, with a story of charitable entities that come together to run schools, to give children a better future. That's the story I want to tell.
And we all need to keep telling that story. Leora, can I finish with a question that's maybe a little bit more personal? Because it's sort of, I've seen over the last 6 years, I've watched like the rest of us in education. You sort of become one of the most influential people in education, and I'm thrilled for it, because I know that sometimes you have to challenge Ofsted, sometimes you have to challenge the government. But does that kind of weigh on you, that this kind of moment that we're in education, both in terms of structures, in terms of, as you mentioned, how the moment that the country is in? How is that for you personally, to kind of navigate all of that? Is it something you relish? Is it how?
John, that's kind of you to say. Not something, not a designation I recognize for myself, but I do feel the weight of responsibility. So I'm going to tell another story. It's a story of a big hat, and this was a colleague and a very dear friend who's now retired told me the story a while ago, actually, when I was appointed to my first director of education job in a London local authority. She was a head teacher at the time, and she gave me some head teacherly advice. And she said, never mistake yourself for the big hat. So the big hat is the role that you currently occupy. It's the authority and the responsibility that comes with that role. But she said, it is a big hat. Take it off at night and remember that you are not the hat. Don't misrepresent yourself in that way. So if there is responsibility and authority conferred on me, John, it's because of the role that I hold, not the person that I am. And that feels like an important distinction to me. But I do feel the weight of that big hat. It's getting heavier and heavier to wear, that hat. And I worry about it constantly. I worry about getting it right for members. I worry about how you navigate difficult territories that members won't always understand. So that balance of working constructively with the government because they have a legitimate democratic mandate, but also representing your members' interests. So you will know I have a reputation typically for not shouting in the press. It's not the way I work. I think we're much more effective when we work with a quieter diplomacy, but we still speak with authority when we have to speak with authority. So I literally worry about that every single day. It occasionally wakes me up at 2:20 in the morning. In that moment of sort of nightmarish fear that I'm not the person to lead, I'm not the person that can get this right. And it becomes more difficult. As CST has become bigger, we now have 3/4 of all academy schools in membership, that the weight of that responsibility is even harder to manage. But I think you have to, so what sustains me in those times? My absolutely wonderful colleague and friend and Deputy Chief Executive of CST, one evening when I was very upset by something that had happened, sent me a poem, and it's a poem called The Centre, and it asks us to remember the quiet centre and to lead from the quiet centre. So I now carry that poem within me, because I'm reminded every day that when you lead, particularly through difficult and challenging circumstances, it is important to block out some of the noise so that you can lead from your quiet centre.
That is relational trust within an organisation. Being sent as an English teacher in a moment, being sent a poem. There is relational trust. Thank you for sharing that, Leora. That was very moving.
Oh, thank you, Leora. And I cannot think of anybody more qualified to be the educational milliner than you, Leora, with your large hat. We're going to have to stop there. We say this all the time, but I've never sat back so much and just listened so intently to such wonderfully narrated pieces of thinking as I have done in that episode. It's been an absolute joy to have you on, Leora. We are getting the nod from Luke, our producer, that we do need to wrap up, but I am sure that attendees at the annual conference are going to be able to listen to equally compelling narratives around the educational landscape. So thank you so much for sharing that with us. And if people haven't already kind of booked to go on the conference or want to follow up on events following the conference, where can they find information?
They can find information from our website. So Googling the Confederation of School Trusts will get you there. Our conference is actually full. We have 1,600 delegates. So we've had to close bookings, I'm afraid. But we're going to try and stream some of perhaps the most important bits of the conference so that people who haven't managed to book a place can still feel that they're part of a conversation.
And this is a heads up for an early bird for next year now, then, isn't it? It's time to get in early. So thank you so much. It's been an absolute delight to listen to you, Leora. Thank you so much for your time. And I know this is going to be a hugely popular episode with everybody, regardless of whether they're in the trust system or whether they are in wider education. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you both. Take care. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Thank you for listening to Mind the Gap. I'm Emma Turner and I've been presenting with my co-host John Hutchinson. If you enjoyed the episode, please leave us a review, share on social media and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Find us on our YouTube channel by searching Mind the Gap with John and Emma, or head over to Spotify for an audio version. This podcast was produced in association with Haringey Education Partnership and our producer is Luke Kemper.